Bonjour, bienvenue à Matinées on Main Street. Je m'appelle Alan, and that's about as much French as I know. This is a podcast about the history of the movies. So far on this podcast, I've talked about the beginnings of photography and the path it followed as we looked at the people who developed that wondrous new novelty. Later, I discussed Edward Muybridge and Governor Leland Stanford, who first met in order to take glamour shots of Stanford's favorite horse, Occident. Now we head to Paris. Since we're still discussing the inventing and developing of a new way of seeing, this science stuff is not going to go away soon. The path that science takes to get to the movies is a long, meandering one. And for the time being, scientists would be the only persons interested in developing this process. What science wanted was not to watch pictures move. Instead, what they wanted was a camera that could take a large number of pictures within a very short period of time. From their large selection of photographs, all of them shot nearly instantaneously, the scientists could pick out the photographs that best suited their needs. Several years from this point, Edward Muybridge would find an interest for a camera like that. But in the early 1870s, the man who wanted to make the camera more productive was a French scientist named Etienne-Jules Marey. He is the man who would construct the first camera capable of taking a number of images at a time, and it was through him that both Muybridge and Edison would be able to take the next steps towards moving pictures. Etienne-Jules Marey was born in eastern France, in Beaune, the most important city of France's Burgundy region. Wine producing is the dominant business there, and his father, Claude Marey, was a wine steward for the Père Bouchard winery. Etienne's family was well off, and he was able to distract himself with his fascination with micromechanics. He loved tinkering with little machines and developed quite a skill making mechanical animals and other micro-toys for his friends. While Marey hoped to enter the field of mechanical sciences, his father was hoping that his son would be interested in something much more prestigious, like maybe becoming the doctor in the family. The Mareys moved to Paris and rented a residence while their son attended a college known as the Faculty of Medicine. Etienne excelled in school, both in his studies and in his clinical work. His interest drifted towards the circulatory system, and he published a paper on a study of how the heart beats. He passed the state competition, which earned him a license, but he failed in the examination that qualified him to teach. Without a teaching job to support him, Marey had to find work. Marey had a degree, but was jobless, so he started a medical practice. Unfortunately, his practice failed within a year. So far, he had followed his father's wishes to the limit, only to see them fall apart. From now on, he would pursue his own interests within the field of medicine. In order to establish an income, he started tutoring students. At the same time, he started doing research work in his own line of interest, physiology, which is the science of the function and movement of organic bodies. That would include any organisms from one-celled microorganisms to humans and other mammals. Physiology is both a very old science and also a new one. It has roots that go back at least to the ancient Greeks and the Chinese. The Greeks wanted to understand the world around them, and that included the first major attempts to understand the organs of the body as well as their function. Unfortunately for them, without anesthesia, peeking into the human body was almost impossible. Instead, research was generally limited to animals. The Romans did some of their own biological investigating, but The rise of the church made it rather unseemly to go poking around people's bodies for the sake of learning. By the 1300s, the Renaissance started to encourage scientific investigation, and that included understanding the human body. Again, it was generally limited to animals, except for the occasional scandals involving grave robbing. Despite all of this effort, it really wasn't until the Enlightenment in the 1700s that scientists started to make headway into the functioning of the parts of the body. Even the concept of cells as the building blocks of life was only about 20 years old when Marey started studying physiology. Marey was much less concerned with the internal organs, their functions and diseases, than he was with the muscles, the skeleton, and movement. He had already devised a machine to measure the heart pulse called a sphygmograph. It's a type of monitor that's still used today. He also built a machine that would measure movement and muscle strength. His methods for research could be simple, such as using sand to understand the patterns of walking and running. But he also built complicated machines in order to measure the individual differences. An example would be to understand the differences that exist between the way an insect flies and the way a bird flies. He worked on the floor of a building once used by the famous French playwright Molière. The large room was subdivided and included a living area, a place where Marey built and tested his instruments, and another room where he did some of his testing. People who visited the lab commented upon its cleanliness and organization, and Marey proved to be quite methodical when it came to researching his subjects. Scientific testing involves measuring, counting, collecting information and numbers, and understanding what the numbers mean and what facts they suggest. Marey tested movement on a number of animals, from insects and birds to horses and people. He was interested in how these muscles were used for walking or flying, whether it was a butterfly, a locust, or a bird. On some insects, he placed reflective paper on their wings in order to better understand their patterns of flight. In his study of birds, he found that they didn't flap their wings in an up and down motion as everyone believes. Instead, the wings move in more of a rotation, rather like rowing. When he analyzed bird skeletons, Marey realized that a bird's sternum was very big when compared to its body. That was to support the large muscles they have in order to fly. As for man, the situation was different. At the time, there was a belief that if man could create the right design, he would be able to fly by himself, using some sort of wings that he could flap. These were ideas similar to gliders, but would require men to move their arms in order to take off and land at will. Marey's research showed that humans didn't have the skeletal support in their chest to build the kind of muscles needed to create flight on their own. Marey said that man would only be able to fly great distances through the use of motors. Marey's conclusions changed the way we thought about flight. From the beginning, man had longed to fly with the birds, and through their hopes we created mythic tales, fanciful dreams, and imaginative inventions. In the late 1700s, two Frenchmen, the Montgolfier brothers, flew a hot air balloon into the sky on the outskirts of Paris. About 15 years later, Sir George Cayley conceived the idea of heavier-than-air flying machines. His idea led to a question. How much power and weight did an engine need for a man to build a flying machine? At first, scientists developed mathematical formulations that were based on the ways they thought that birds flapped their wings. These formulas predicted the weight and power that was necessary. But Marey's research into birds and flight claimed that these numbers were wrong. His research suggested that a plane's engine would not need as much power or be as heavy as the old numbers suggested. Of course, there were many men who didn't believe Marey's claims and stuck to the old numbers. Eventually, the Wright brothers would be among the first people to modify their formulas and charts using Marey's calculations. Marey would continue his work to understand the basics of flight, but by the early 1870s, he was looking for something that his instruments and graph sheets couldn't produce: actual images that showed the stages of a bird's flight. This would require a machine that could take pictures rapidly, several images in a second. At the time, that seemed impossible. The box camera that took wet plate photos was very slow. Even though the collodion's reaction time was now down to half a minute or so, photographers still needed to replace each glass plate with another. Marey needed to take multiple images in under a second. In the early 1880s, he would devise this camera based on an astronomical photo machine developed by Jules Janssen, but that's for another episode. While it was Marey's need to devise this rapid shot camera that would eventually lead to the development of the movie camera, it was one of Marey's other fields of investigation that led to the movies. That was when he started to analyze the steps in the movement of horses. In the late 19th century, horses were the dominant source of transportation in our lives. They pulled carts, plowed fields, carried riders, guided trolleys, were bet on in races, carried families across the continent, and even in death they were rendered into things such as fabric for chairs and fat for soap. In the early 1860s, Marey and Dr. Auguste Chavot used a horse to determine whether blood flow was caused by the heart's muscle contraction or by its relaxation. This research was important enough for the two men to win major prizes in the field of medicine. A few years later, Marey would again use horses in his tests, this time in a less invasive way. What he wanted was to analyze a horse's gait. He would write that no topic in animal movement had given rise to more labor and greater controversy than the questions of the paces of a horse. He read a great many articles and books on the subject, and everyone's individual opinion was different. From his point of view, all scientific thought on the subject was based on observation rather than on measurement. Marey's viewpoints on his colleagues' conclusions rattled cages in his field of research. Some of his fellow physiologists were thinking of Marey as some kind of scientific heretic. He was stepping into a hot topic of discussion, and no one had taken the high ground. Marey's conclusions were sometimes seen as radical, although there were many who agreed with his insights. In the end, he would be proven right enough to earn important awards and to have facilities named after him. He would also be right enough to inspire Muybridge and Stanford to investigate the way a horse moved on its own. Marey's process involved measuring the sequence of a horse's hooves as it walked, trotted, cantered, and galloped. He wanted to know which hoof was in which position during the time that a horse moved. With some horses, he placed a small, hollow rubber ball at the bottom of each foot, just inside its shoe. A long tube was attached to it and ran to a monitor held by the rider. Acting a bit like an arch support, each time the horse stepped, it squeezed the ball, transferring this pressure up the line and registering its step. With other horses, he had the monitors attached to their legs right above the hooves. Marey stated that he had 3 reasons for this series of tests on the steps of a horse's gait. The first was simply to identify the patterns. As he said, the durations, actions, and reactions of each pace. Through this, he also wanted to know its rhythms and which steps were stronger than the others. The second issue he attempted to settle was the sound of a horse's gallop. When a horse gallops, its rhythms make a sound of 3 beats: ta-da-da, 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 Ta-da-da. There were people who wondered why there was no fourth beat, as a horse had 4 legs. Marey proved that on the second beat, 2 of the horse's hooves hit the ground at the same time. His last reason was to help artists figure out the proper placement of a horse's steps when they painted or drew a horse. Before photography arrived, the world was visually explained through art. There was always something called artistic license, which meant that an artist may twist reality to fit the purpose of his painting. This could be changing colors or rearranging objects to create a visual balance in his picture. Everyone knew that artists painted portraits to flatter their sitters rather than to tell the truth. So there had always been an argument over how a horse's feet were arranged in a painting. How a horse looked when it jumped over a hedge was pretty well known, but there were a number of paintings that showed the same kind of jump even though there was no object being jumped over. In the issue of artistic truthfulness, Marey explained in both diagrams and words how a horse's feet were arranged in its various forms of movement. In 1873, he released a book titled La Machine Animale, which was a compilation of the papers he had previously published on his work in animal and human movement. Besides the trade magazine articles, he also expanded upon some of his subjects more fully. The following year, the work was translated into English and published in the UK. The translated title was The Animal Mechanism. The phrase was occasionally used at that time as a way to explain a scientific concept of the period. It was based on the Enlightenment ideas that attempted to see life as a form of machinery. This view also led scientists to believe that they could understand human and animal behavior in a mechanical way. We're still doing that, only now the comparisons are with computers and software. Things like measuring brain size and reading the bumps on people's heads were a curious part of this early form of thinking. But Marey's work wasn't about mechanical theorizing, but instead was simply the result of a lot of measuring, comparing, and contrasting. Through this, he was able to contribute to other areas of scientific thought, such as the development of aviation and the start of the cinema movement. His books were for scientists and libraries, and he got little mention in the popular press. But among scientists, it proved to be quite impressive. Surprisingly, America didn't print the book until 1879, at just about the same time that Muybridge and Stanford started their next round of horse photographs. Did his American edition have an influence on their work? Some sources suggest that the 2 men had been planning this up to a year before they started, a time that predated the American version of the book. Could an English edition of Marey's work have motivated the 2 gentlemen? Possibly. They did say that they discussed Marey's work rather extensively before they shot their pictures in the spring of 1879. What's a little more likely is that the 2 men discussed the subject after it had been highlighted in Scientific American magazine a few months before the American publication of Marey's book. It would be a period of over 5 years between the publication of his book in France and Muybridge's and Stanford's important second round of horse photographs. But before we get there, we have a few other topics to discuss. Next time, we'll take a look at Thomas Edison, then America's most important inventor, and the invention that will prove to be the machine that would not only kick Edison's interest in the movies, it'll also lay the groundwork for all the mistakes he would make during his research into making movie machines, as well as the movies. Thanks for listening.